Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, Chopin. What do they all have in common? They're what are called common practice era composers, and they may also eventually become extinct. But how could that ever be true? Well, let me tell you a story. It's a story about Western music's history and development that people have been taught for a while now, and it goes something like this. In the beginning, composers and performers lacked a unified theory of music making, and so they had to rely on their ears and their own musical systems and traditions of organizing sound. This is the way the musical world mostly operated until Johann Sebastian Bach comes along and cracks the code in the form of tonal harmony. Thus, an era of common practice across the West is born, and it lasts until about the beginning of the 20th century, when composers finally start stretching tonality to its limits. The peak of organized and sensible music has come and gone, and once again composers are left to wander in the dark. The purpose of this video is to try and reframe this sort of depressing and very inaccurate narrative, and to provide a new one in which this golden common practice era is actually kind of a strange anomaly. That it's actually an exception to the rule of how things have mostly been done, and will likely continue to be done for the foreseeable future. So, tonal harmony as we understand it today was not an inevitability by any means, but it dominated those 250 years or so for good reason. It's one of the most convincing, beautiful, and organized ways of approaching music that Western musicians have ever come up with. The supposed state of uncertainty that musicians were in before the common practice era is actually more similar to how contemporary musicians are working today than it is to, say, how Mozart and Beethoven were writing music during the common practice era. And the first of many parallels between these two worlds is their thoughts on tuning systems, or really that they had any thoughts about it at all. Because the keys on a keyboard didn't always make the exact sounds that we hear them make today. There were other systems of tuning, like mean tone or just intonation, all kinds of tuning systems aside from equal temperament, which is what we use today. Prior to the common practice era, composers experimented with different tuning systems depending on what key they were playing in, what instrument they were writing for, or just the composer's personal taste. So it's easy to overlook the seemingly natural tuning system of equal temperament. But as the composer and theorist Douglas Leedy reminds us, in the history of Western music, the keyboard temperament with the longest run was mean tone. And it might come as a surprise that in terms of longevity, the de facto tuning is not equal temperament, and that mean tone lasted as long as the 18th century in parts of South America. And although equal temperament was chosen, champions of mean tone might argue that such a democratic tuning system robs music of its character. Many contemporary composers like Lamont Young or Wendy Carlos and Douglas Leedy have opted to reopen the discussion of temperament by drawing from Eastern music scales, microtonality, or even a return to various mean tone systems. Others, like American composer Lou Harrison, go as far as to say that equal temperament is an all-out disaster. He was quoted as saying, "Equal temperament destroys everything and is not for the human ear." Now, it's important to understand that having one single temperament dominating the music of composers around the entire Western world, like it did during the common practice era, is a strange occurrence in the grand scheme of history. Just as many composers from the pre-common practice era didn't abide by one all-encompassing tuning system, the prevailing attitude of contemporary composers is clear. In order to move forward, we have to go back, because in its early stages, Western music was primarily populated by individuals doing much of their work by developing theories on their own. But that's not to say that trends didn't emerge among groups of artists. For example, Monteverdi was constructing his operatic music with some similar foundational principles as his contemporaries. But he was using harmonic progressions that were of his own creation, and they were pretty different than other composers of his day. Italian madrigal composers congregated around the purpose of writing similar motets, but they were a regionally bound clique of musicians. This is much less so the case when you get to the Common Practice era. Tonality's influence spread across borders, genre, composers, and decades. The development of music was cumulative, each composer looking at the last and seeking out improvements and innovations. But the foundations of tonality wouldn't be questioned or restructured until right around the turn of the 20th century. Earlier composers were developing their own musical languages and systems, not totally without influence from their peers and predecessors, but in a musical climate that didn't have an overarching tonal palette, which sounds a lot more like the culture contemporary composers are working in today. Alright, if you've made it this far into the video, congratulations, you're a huge music nerd. But I'm sorry to tell you that it does not get any less nerdy from here, so just bear with me. But let's imagine a world in which music was never codified at all. There were no written scores, no sharps or flats, no music theory. In this world, music only exists as a purely listening experience for the composer, the performer, and the listener. What kind of attributes would be left to describe this kind of music? Well, there was an article written in 2015 by music theory professor whiz Patricia Howland, and her article might be able to shed some light on this hypothetical world. It has the extremely inviting title of Formal Structures in Post-Tonal Music, and it actually addresses the question of how to describe contemporary music in which none of the rules of tonal harmony apply. She outlines 5 key descriptors to deal with post-tonal music, which she lovingly calls integrated parametric structures, or IPSs. The 5 types include tension and release, departure and return, symmetry, direction, and what she calls the steady state. And although these are very useful parameters that you can use to discuss post-tonal music, many of these features would be apt descriptions for our imaginary theoryless world as well. Now, of course, this is not the world we live in by any means, but her ideas align much closer with the world as it was before an all-encompassing systematic approach to music started snowballing in the first place. Prior to the Common Practice era, composers relied on exactly these kinds of parameters to inform their musical decisions and allowed them to codify their own musical languages, one of which just happened to have developed into tonal harmony. And then the rest is history. Let me be clear though, I'm not disparaging the music of the Common Practice era. Some of the most undeniably beautiful and thoughtful music has come from this time. So why might it be helpful to reframe our understanding of music history in this way? First, I hope it gives contemporary and future composers more confidence to charge ahead into uncharted territory without fear of being compared to the monolith composers from the classical and romantic periods. The sheer amount of incredible music from this time is definitely a product of the composers, but not only a product of the composers. It's important to understand that the very fabric of their genius is made up of tonal systems that were grandfathered to them through factors beyond any one composer's musical ideas. In our era and in future ones, there will probably never be such a sturdy fabric from which to sew again. Maybe a new practice will emerge that sparks a whole renaissance of prolific output again. So will Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart be forgotten anytime soon? Probably not. But looking back in 100 or 200 years from now, the Common Practice era might be a relatively small blip on the radar, during which the limits of tonality were stretched and exhausted. You never know. Anyway, feel free to like and drop a comment or subscribe. I'd be interested to hear other people's thoughts on this. Thanks for watching.